The LPA inspector role and responsibilities, I must say that our inspectors with ODOT have done an exceptional job over the years, and they are building their knowledge and their abilities on how to perform monitoring of the DBEs and other issues that are out on the project, because they're there more often than one compliance officer can cover anywhere from 50 to 80 projects in a year. And so it is very important for the inspectors who are out on the job to assist in all of these roles. Monitoring responsibilities include prevailing wage interview forms. If the EEO DBE prevailing wage coordinator for the LPA is not able to get to the project and see all of the employees and ensure that their wages are being paid appropriately, including fringe benefits. Also monitoring trucking operations. This is a huge, huge issue in the industry, as we all know. Trucking operations have different guidelines. We're going to cover those guidelines in a little bit, but there are many DBE trucking operations that also operate on LPA projects, just like ODOT projects. And those CUF requirements are quite stringent, and they do need to be monitored. The CUF observation field forms. Those field forms are just like anything else. They are part of the normal process of review by the district construction LPA engineer or construction monitor, as it may be. So those CUF observation field forms are once per contract and once per DBE. Now, while that's only one time, you should always monitor if that DBE shows up as a different crew, comes in with a different name. Those would be violations and should be noted on a CUF observance field form, even if you've already conducted one on the DBE firm itself. The bulletin board monitoring, that's a given. Anybody that goes from ODOT or anybody from a local agency administering a construction project, it is part of the FHWA 1273 requirement that the bulletin board be visible, accessible, and easy to get to, include all of the items, which we'll have a checklist for here in a little bit to show you, and make sure that it is up and erected at the time the project starts. There are subcontractors that start before the prime contractors, so these boards are very important. Any inspector knows the part about the daily diary activities and the entries, but what's really important is just documenting as much information as possible. I mean, this information we utilize this information, at ODOT for prevailing wage. We utilize this information for DBE monitoring to make sure that we've got employees that are actually employed by the DBE company. So the diary information itself is really, really vital. And any non-compliance that an inspector may see on site, they should be reporting that immediately to the LPA, EEO, DBE prevailing wage coordinator. That individual then would start just looking into everything, trying to make sure that everything lines up the way it's supposed to, and if it doesn't, they can start corrective action plans and contacting the prime contractor to indicate if there are some violations going on that are being observed on the project. This is an example of a prevailing wage interview form. As I said, these are examples. Some of you may use this type of a form. Some of you may have a different type of an interview form that have been handed out over the years. These interview forms are part of the appendices for the local programs manual in the construction part. So most of these forms and most of these examples are just simply what they are. They're an example. Whatever is in the appendices for the local programs manual in the construction part is what you should be utilizing. This is a CUF field observation form. It's also an example. There are variations of this form. Again, I want to mention that this form should be completed in full. That means the project number, whether that's your local project number, or you should include the PID number, which is the project identification number that comes from ODOT. That way we can readily identify what project this is actually belonging to for requirements. The county, the prime contractor, the DBE's subcontractor or foreman on the project, when the DBE started, when they anticipate to be complete. Where it says ODOT reviewer, obviously that means the LPA reviewer, whoever is doing it, whether it's the inspector, which is what we're hoping for, that all of our inspectors and all of the LPA inspectors or engineers would be out there doing these. The title of that individual and the review date. Then, of course, we want the DBE name. Sometimes that's left off when we see it at ODOT, so we have to ask, what was the DBE? Sometimes we can figure it out based on the performance that they have put in the description. And when you put in a description of scope of work, you should really be detailed with that, at least to some extent. If you just say that a DBE company was on site and they were setting guardrail, well, did you see any other function of that DBE? Were they providing the guardrail? Did they install the guardrail? Was the guardrail delivered by someone else? Those types of notes are very helpful in regards to CUF violations or potentially CUF fraud. It goes on and explains the supervision questions, employee questions, performance, equipment, and then finally the CUF. So there's a place for comments as well if you need to add additional comments to that. The district LPA construction monitor, again, I want to mention, will be checking for the completion of these forms as part of the normal project documentation review. The bulletin board checklist that I spoke of earlier, this is for a federal project. I realize that some of the locals do have federal state exchange projects, which there is a state bulletin board checklist similar to this, although the posters are different. And so if you do need the state checklist, it will also be available to you. This is actually when you're on the job, you indicate the date that you observed the bulletin board, you indicate the project number or PID number as it is for an LPA job. The prime contractor must have their EEO policy and EEO contact information on their bulletin boards and the federal wage rates that are in effect. And that is included in your bid template documents when you are letting your projects. So those wage rates must be posted and visible for all employees to be able to see. The rest of the posters are federally required or state required, and you just check the box underneath that you did visually see those posters. If you did not see them, then you should make note. You should contact the LTA, EEO, DBE prevailing wage coordinator to make sure that the prime contractor is notified that they are missing a poster or missing the wage rate and get that corrected as soon as possible. Quickly, we'll briefly cover the daily diary tracking. I think I've covered that pretty well, but I'm going to go ahead and mention again the importance of it. The daily diary should document all contractors working on site. You want to separate those by the prime and whatever subs are working. Any DBE firms that are working, you would want to call them out separately. You would want to document their work and all the other contractors' work separately. The type of work being performed for each contractor working on site daily, and the number of workers and their classifications. And some of you may be saying, well, I don't know the classifications for all of these folks. Well, you know construction. So if you see people building forms for a bridge deck or doing labor activities, then you know that it's a carpenter or a laborer. If you see someone operating a backhoe or a paver, then you obviously know that's an equipment operator. then, or if you see someone driving a truck, then you've got a truck driver on the job. So those are general classifications, although classifications are listed on the prevailing wage, the federal wage rates, the classifications are spelled out on those wage rates. Equipment type and labeling, that's very important to note in the diaries, just because, especially for DBEs, if they are a milling operation, let's say, for a DBE, then obviously they should have their own equipment. It should be named by the DBE's name, and they should not be utilizing the prime contractor or another subcontractor's equipment. If they are leasing equipment, we'll go over that in a minute. They do have to have that agreement with the equipment or with the truck, and it does need to be a long-term lease. We'll cover that briefly in a minute. Trucking operations on site, again, this is ultimately important. Trucking is another animal all in itself, and I've dealt with it for many years. It's quite difficult. So any notations in the diary are going to be very, very helpful and useful. Truck marking requirements. You can read over this. At ODOT, the field personnel, we monitor it, but we do not enforce this. This is not an enforcement avenue that we have. But they do have to follow these requirements, and it's per the 49 CFR, and you'll note that it's 390.1. And we do expect all contractors and subcontractors to adhere to these regulations regarding commercial motor vehicle markings and identification. You can read that. There are also Ohio interstate federal regulations, which is part 390.21. So motor carriers of any kind should be easily recognizable with their US DOT number and their identification on the truck or equipment. Now we're going to go into another video. This is evaluating commercially useful function. Please note this is a video that was brought to us. I'm fairly certain it came from FHWA's website, and it is examples. So while you watch that, you should learn a few different things about commercially useful function and monitoring.